All right, good morning. Happy Friday. This is Fitness Athlete Friday on your PT on Ice daily show. I am Megan Peach. I am one of the lead faculty for the endurance division, specifically for rehab of the injured runner, both live and online. Um, we just started a new cohort for the online course that starts this week. If you miss that cohort, be sure to jump into the next one. It starts in May. They've been going really, really well. It's a really fun way to just build your running community online. Um, our next live uh, our next live rehab of the injured runner course is in June of this year. It is in Pennsylvania. So if you haven't caught the live course, be sure to get that in June. So today I want to talk about how not to be a running coach. So stick with me on this one. We're all coaches, right? We're all physical therapists. We're all coaches. We coach our patients and clients on a daily basis. We coach them on new movement patterns. We coach them on running gait retraining drills. We might coach them on their athlete ecosystem, their nutrition, their sleep, their stress. So we're doing a tremendous amount of coaching as we see these patients and clients through their rehab process. But I'm not a running coach. I have no desire to create running training programs from scratch. And that's a big part of a running coach's job is to create these individualized training programs for the runners to complete a 5K or a half marathon or a marathon. And it takes a tremendous amount of time to create these individualized programs. That's not my job. I love taking a runner from their injured state to a healthy state. I love the whole eval process. I love giving runners tools that they can use to continue running as they rehab an injury. I love seeing them through that injury into more of a healthy running state. And I love the injury prevention discussion on what they can do to maintain just a healthy running program as they kind of leave me in that rehab space and go on to just continue running. So I'm not in that space to create running training programs from scratch. One, it's not my lane, it's not what I love. But two, it does take a lot of time. So I don't want that patient to come in for their 45-minute or 60-minute appointment and have me spend all of my time trying to create this training program for them when really my expertise lies other places and I can be of most help to them when I'm talking about running mechanics or I'm talking about injury and rehab and strength and other things that might play a role either in the development of injury or their prevention of injury later on. So I really want to stay out of the space of creating these specialized, individualized running training programs. Now, if your runner wants to go and hire a coach, that's awesome. I am in full support of that 100% of the time. It can be a really good way to collaborate and build your running community. Um, if they want to do that, if they're amenable to that, I am on board. Not all runners are there yet. And when a runner comes in and they say, "Can you give me a program? What's your favorite program for your half marathon? What's your favorite program for the marathon? Can you write me a marathon program?" My knee-jerk reaction is to just say no, but we could do better than that. And that's not going to make anyone happy just to say no. And there are things that we can do with existing programs to make them more individualized for that runner sitting in front of you. Um, and to avoid the situation where you're spending your own time or their time sitting in front of you creating a program from scratch. So when a runner comes in and they want an individualized program, I'm not going to say no. There are some tips that I'm going to give you, tools that we're going to talk about just in the next few minutes that you can use in clinic when they are sitting in front of you to modify existing training programs to make them more individualized and to avoid creating from scratch. Okay, so One of the caveats is that that runner brings in a program. So if they ask for a program, I'm always going to say, go ahead and take the next week or next 2 weeks and do your research and bring me a program that you think looks appropriate for you. So that program might be based on their status as a runner, either beginner or runner with a little bit more experience. It might be based on it. Very likely it's based on the length of the event, if it's a half marathon or a marathon. So I want them to go and do that initial legwork and bring me back a program the next time that they're in the clinic. And then we can go and make those modifications. But at least we have somewhere to start. So the first thing I'm going to look at with that program that they bring in is the length of time in total for the program. And usually it's in a number of weeks. And I'm going to look at the length of time because it can be it can be modulated quite easily, but it's a good place to start to recognize if that program is appropriate for the runner sitting in front of you. So, for example, if you have a novice runner who wants to run a marathon. Let's say they've run a few 5Ks, but they've never really run much longer distances before. They want to run a marathon. Awesome. I love that goal. I think it's a great goal. I think it's totally achievable for most recreational runners. Um, and they bring you in a 16-week program. If they're a novice runner, they don't have a whole lot of race history under their belt, 16 weeks might not be long enough for them to really accumulate the volume that they need in terms of weekly running volume and total running volume for them to really be successful at that marathon event. They're probably going to need a little bit longer of a program. Likewise, if you get a novice runner and they want to run a 5K, let's say they don't have any race history and they just want to run a 5K and they bring in an 8-week program, that's probably entirely appropriate. So when I say I want to look at the total length of time for the program, I do want to look at the length, but then I'm also considering the running experience as well as the event that they're training for. Those can be two really important factors in determining the length of a running program. The next thing I want to look at is the peaks in running volume. Now, most programs are going to come with some kind of metric that indicates the amount of weekly volume that program is programmed for. And so usually it's in weekly miles. So how many miles that runner is going to run per week. And they'll have a tally at the end of each week. And so it's a good metric that you can look at really, really quickly. And you can just kind of skim down all 12 or 16 or 20 weeks of that program. And you can really quickly get an idea of what the highest volume is for that program. Now, that's really important because programs with high running volume can put a runner at an increased risk of injury. So if I'm looking down my marathon program and I see 5 weeks in a row of 40 plus miles per week, then that's kind of a red flag. That's a red flag for that could be potential for injury for that runner and potentially take them out of that training program and lead them to a situation where they're not going to be able to run that race or at least get to the start line. So when I see 4 plus 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 weeks of really high volume per week, that's a red flag. I need to modify that to be more appropriate for that runner. Take that with a grain of salt. There are runners out there who need lots of consecutive weeks of high volume. So ultra runners, for example, might need a lot of weeks back to back of very high volume. Doesn't mean they can't take recovery weeks. It's just going to look a little bit different for them. So when I see these multiple consecutive weeks of high volume, so 4, 5, 6, 35 plus 40 miles a week, I want to add in a week there. Either add in a recovery week or take one of those high volume weeks and then drop that volume down to about a 50%. If they're running 40 miles, take that down to 20 miles. Now, you can't take running away from a runner and not add anything back in. It's not going to go well. That runner is not going to be happy. I can almost guarantee that. And so if you take away activity from that runner, specifically running, make sure you're adding in recommendations for recovery. So you're adding on mobility exercises. You may be adding on a swim session. You may be adding on something else that allows them to be active, but isn't going to tax their workload or add on to their workload, and really actually allows them to recover during that week so that they're avoiding those multiple consecutive weeks in training volume or high training volume. The third thing you can do here, again, looking at volume, is how did they get to that high volume? So if they peak at 40 miles per week for their weekly high volume, how did they get there? Did they start with 2 or 3 weeks of 10 miles per week, for example, and then all of a sudden ramp up to 30 miles or 40 miles per week? I see it a lot. It sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I see it a lot in training programs. Or was it a stepwise kind of gradual approach to get to that high volume, which we would want to see? So if you were to graph out all those high volume numbers, you should see this stepwise increase in weekly volume, and maybe some drop downs as well to indicate recovery weeks. But if you don't see that and you see this jump from 15 miles a week to 40 miles a week or 10 miles a week to 20 miles a week, that's an indication for an increased risk of injury. Maybe they were injured at that point if this is a previous program, but it could also be potentially a risk for injury if this is a program that they want to do. So we want to avoid those big jumps in weekly volume. And the last one here is more of a subjective approach to this. So all of the recommendations I've described so far in terms of looking at the weekly volume, how many consecutive weeks they're at, or looking at how they ramped up to that weekly volume, or looking at the actual time frame for that program, those are all quantitative metrics. So those are all quantities that you can really quickly glance at. You can see the numbers, it's easy, but we can also ask some more subjective or qualitative questions. And this can give you a really good insight into how that runner is doing with a training program, or how they have done with training programs in the past if you're programming for a new program. You can also ask them, if you don't have a program in front of you that they've used already, you can ask them how the previous weeks of training have gone, and specifically how they're feeling after their long run. If they're training for a longer race, such as a half marathon or a marathon, how long does it take for them to recover? Is it taking 1 or 2 days and then they kind of feel back to normal and ready to go and ready to jump into the next training week? Or are they waking up fatigued? Are they low on energy? Are they having difficulty sleeping? Are they having any of those things that might indicate overtraining? In that case, you might have to back off a little bit on training. It will give you a little bit of insight into future training for them and some things you can modify in terms of how they reacted to previous training that they've done. So if they have a very high volume week and then it takes them an entire week to recover, or they're very fatigued for a couple weeks on end, or they're not resting, they're not sleeping well, they're not adding in recovery modalities that complement those high training volume weeks, then that could be a really easy way to program in some specific things that are individualized for them in their future program. So looking at the numerical metrics is really, really important in a program, but we also need to know how that specific runner is going to respond to certain training, and how they've responded to training in the past can really help you program in some of their future programs, and get you a lot of information really quickly. So to recap, I'm not a running coach. I'm probably never going to be a running coach. I don't want to spend my time creating training programs for other people, and certainly not clinic time. So valuable when that person is sitting in front of us. And I want to spend that valuable time looking at other things, looking at strength or programming strength or biomechanics or running gait retraining, just to keep that injured runner running. And my time is probably not as valuable if we're sitting there talking about training programs. But there are tools we can use. So the tools that I mentioned are looking at the length of a training program, really easily modifiable. We can look at the number of consecutive weeks of high volume training. We can easily modify that by taking down that number to 3 or 4 weeks and then having a recovery week. or just inserting a recovery week into those consecutive weeks of high volume training. We also want to look at how they got to that high volume training. Did they ramp up really, really quickly, or did they slowly, gradually get to those high volume weeks? And then the last one, but probably very important, is how they are feeling subjectively, how they've recovered in the past from high volume training or longer runs. That can give you insight into how you might add in recovery to their future training programs. So I hope that helps. Again, jump into some of those online rehab of the injured runners. We have a lot of fun. It has been such a good way to build community. That is it for me. I hope you have an awesome Friday and an awesome weekend, and we'll see you soon.